Well, thank you, Jackie. It's really great to be here on this beautiful day. It's every day at Princeton's like this, right? Right? Or I brought it down from Ithaca. It's probably snowing in Ithaca right now. So I'm really happy to be here to share some new work that I'm working on with Jake Rue about the link between immigration enforcement and the housing crisis, and particularly how the program called the 287G program, the deputized police officers as local police officers as immigration agents, help to fuel the foreclosure crisis among Latinos. Jake and I have been working on this for maybe about a year and a half. Jake is at Brigham Young University, and many of you know him as an OPR graduate and a great demographer. So I don't need to tell anybody in this room that the Latino population has undergone very rapid and sudden change over the course of the last several decades. You can see from the graph on the left side both the observed and the projected share of the Latino population. Currently about 1 in 6 Americans are U.S. residents are Latino, and that is projected to grow over the course of the next 50 years to close to a third. And so this population has been growing very rapidly and substantially, and is a dominant force in U.S. institutions. And the growth isn't happening entirely in the cities and the states that we commonly associate with immigration, not just in New York and California and Texas anymore, but happening everywhere. And so you can see that the map over there is just showing you kind of the relative change in the Hispanic population during the 2000s. And the point is that the Latino population has diffused to virtually every community in the country, and so this growth that we're seeing in Latino and immigrant representation is happening everywhere, but especially throughout the Great Plains and throughout the southern Atlantic regions. Now this also happens to continue, this growth is continuing during a time of net negative migration from Mexico, or at least declining migration from Mexico, rapidly declining migration from Mexico. And so the point here is that the population is going to continue to grow regardless of the outcome of this election and regardless of our immigration policy regime, that the Latino population is here to stay and it's going to continue to grow, when that the economic prospects and the political prospects of our country are kind of intimately tied to incorporation of this growing population, right? So what happens to the children of the second generation kids, what's happening to Latino families is really important for trying to understand what's happening or where the country is headed over the next several generations. So there's a variety of reasons for the slowdown in migration that many of you are familiar with, the slowdown in Mexican migration. Mostly or largely has to do with changes in the economic structure of Mexico, and particularly with fertility change in Mexico. But immigration enforcement has played a non-trivial role in slowing down the growth of the Latino and the Mexican population. And so what you see here on the left side is a graph that shows the number of deportations basically over the last decade in the United States. And if you listen to the rhetoric from one of our presidential candidates, you wouldn't think that we're deporting about 400,000 persons per year. And so what you see from this graph are a couple of things. One is that we deport a lot of people, right? And that the United States immigration system is deporting, and if we looked at detentions, the bars would be even significantly higher than this. We're detaining and deporting a lot of people on an annual basis. And the second thing you see is that this wasn't just a process these deportations didn't decline with the arrival of the Obama administration. Right, that the ramp up of deportations started during the Bush administration and continued into the Obama administration, and has reached record numbers. Okay, so since 2013, it's dipped modestly, but they're still very high. They're still at very high levels. And the thing to remember is that, or one key thing to remember from this is that these deportations are almost exclusively have to do with the experiences of Mexicans and Central Americans, right? So our estimates from the data that we have from the DHS is actually quite difficult to gain access to, suggests that the overwhelming majority, 94% by our estimate, of the deportations are individuals that are Latino. Now, this huge experience with deportation that has been equated to the African American experience of mass incarceration is one of two forces that slammed the Hispanic population during the 2000s, right? So not only were Hispanics being deported in record numbers, but they were experiencing the burden of the housing crisis to a greater extent than any other group. Okay, so we're all familiar with the impacts of the housing crisis and the number of foreclosures that ensued, but the message that Latinos were hit hardest by the foreclosure crisis has been somewhat undertold in this process. And so you can see here from some analysis that I've done using PSID data, the cumulative foreclosure start rates. These actually aren't the total foreclosure rates, so those are a little bit lower, but the number of people that entered foreclosure is very high for Latinos. By our estimate, about 20% of Latino homeowners experienced foreclosure by the end of the housing crisis, and that this resulted in about 4 million Latinos being foreclosed on. Okay, so in total we're talking about 10 million foreclosures over this time period, and that Latinos accounted for over a third of that share. So let me break down each of these, and then I'll share a little bit more about where we're headed with this analysis. So let me start with the housing crisis. So the housing crisis was arguably the most profound residential disaster of the last century. It impacted families in a way that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. It devastated wealth, it devastated communities. It also spurred an enormous migration process where people had to uproot themselves and move. There's been a huge body of work that has explored the broader impacts of foreclosures. We also know the story about how this was created, this toxic combination of expectations that housing values would forever increase, weak regulation, and risky and predatory lending and borrowing on behalf of homeowners. And we can see this from lots of different metrics. During the boom, housing prices soared, and predatory lending, subprime loans increased by a factor of 9. And then during the bust, right, housing prices bottomed out and mortgage defaults exploded. Okay, and then foreclosures resulted. And as I've already implied, the impacts of all of these processes have been strongly conditioned or strongly related to the racial ethnic background of homeowners, in that Latinos had the highest foreclosure rates, followed by African Americans, and whites and Asians had substantially lower rates. Now, this doesn't suggest that these groups didn't experience foreclosures in large numbers, but that the Latino population was particularly hard hit by this. And some of the reasons that we know that Latinos were hard hit have to do with a variety of factors. So one is just that they were simply concentrated in areas that, particularly in the Sun Belt, where the housing crisis, where the boom and the bust was most severe. Okay, so they were located in housing markets that were extremely hard hit. They were also, throughout the 90s and the early part of the 2000s, rapidly integrating into the mainstream according to some measures, but they were certainly rapidly integrating in terms of home ownership. So they were buying homes at a much higher clip than other groups were during the time that these mortgage companies were developing these risky packages and signing risky loans. Okay, so the loans that they were signing were differentially had differential risk, even within the same metropolitan area. And of course, this is layered upon their social vulnerability, their linguistic isolation, what I'll talk about later, sometimes mixed legal status, limited education, discrimination. All of these factors played into the fact that the loans that they were signing tended to hold kind of negative features. But even when we count for all of these factors, there's still kind of a residual effect of being Latino on foreclosures. There's some unknown dynamic. There's something else that's happening that we can't explain why Latinos have these really high foreclosure rates. And so what I want to argue today is that we think that part of the missing link here is immigration enforcement, is connected to that argument, or is connected to the growth in deportations that occurred during the 2000s. Okay, so I already showed you the trend in deportations. We're deporting in the last few years about 400,000. Let me put that number in perspective. 400,000 people per year. We're detaining another probably 100,000 people on top of that per year. And so we have record numbers of deportations during a time, again, of declining migration. And what's really important to remember is that the bulk of the growth in those deportations is not coming along the border. A lot of the deportations are at the border, but the growth was driven by changes in our immigration priorities that prioritized interior enforcement. That is going to homes, going to workplaces, going to some of the stories that I've heard, churches and other sorts of places where Latinos are living, and arresting people and detaining them and deporting them. So you can see that the growth in interior enforcement has, during that time period, surged, right? It doubled. Most of the deportations, at least until very recently, have been non-criminals, have been non-violent criminals, especially, right? So that we're not deporting kind of the worst, as Donald Trump would say, the worst of Mexico. We're actually deporting people who have working lives, who often have deep roots within the country. But the point is that they are a very significant portion of deported individuals have strong attachment to labor markets and are working, and they're dominated by not only Mexicans but also men. Okay. And it's also critical to remember that the effects of deportation extend well beyond those that actually are deported, right? The effects for those deported are severe, but they extend to the communities and the neighborhoods, to the workplaces, to the classrooms of all of these places, but they also extend, or the effects are probably most powerful within the families, right? And that's partly because maybe one person within a household would be deported and not the whole family. But it's also because there's a very large portion of the undocumented population that is in mixed status households. And I have this estimate here that by our measures, about a third of undocumented Latinos live in households where there's an authorized or a documented adult, right? So there's their mixed status homes. And so this might be a spouse that is native born, this might be a spouse that is legal, this might be a family member, this might be somebody else. But those households rely on the money that is being generated by those working age men mostly. And so I'll outline that link between income loss that's associated with deportation and foreclosure in a minute here. But it's also important to remember that as the Latino population is growing, right, it's diffusing throughout the entire country. It's moving away from California and into Georgia and North Carolina and everywhere else in the nation. And it was no accident that the devolution of our immigration policies from the federal level to the local level coincided with this shift of the Latino population eastward. And so a lot of this surge in immigration, or surge in deportations, was not driven by a ramp up of ICE enforcements that in the number of ICE raids conducted solely by ICE. It was actually driven almost entirely by changes in our policies that allowed local police officers to arrest, to interrogate, and detain migrants, and to pass them off to ICE. And there's a couple of programs that you may be familiar with. The more recent one is called Secure Communities. I'll talk a little bit more about Secure Communities in a second. But the program that was most influential during this time was called the 287G program. Now, the 287G program was signed into law in 1996 as part of the, let's see if I can get this right, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, right, Doug? Yeah, or IRARA. And another one of these convoluted names that was, a combination of the Democrats and the Republicans finding some agreement that kind of did during that time. Anyway, so it changed the Immigration and Nationality Act and inserted this clause, Section 287G, that allowed the federal government to enter into agreements with local officials or local jurisdictions to enter into these MOAs where they would provide some coordination of the efforts. Okay, now it was a little bit fuzzy as to what that coordination actually meant at the time, and during the 90s, there was only one county, Salt Lake City County, that actually tried to enter into an agreement with DHS in order to help with fraudulent documentation. They never actually completed the agreement. The first agreement wasn't signed until 2002 when Florida sought to provide better coordination in the wake of 9/11 and provide kind of better tracking of potential terror suspects. 287G became particularly important in 2006 when Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, which is where Charlotte's located, launched a program that was explicitly designed to detain and eradicate the undocumented population. The language that was used in county council meetings that was actually in the agreement with DHS was explicitly formed to eliminate the undocumented population. The sheriff of Mecklenburg County, it's Pendergraft, I forget, Jim Pendergraft, later became, or the following year became, the director of ICE's Office of Local and State Coordination. And Mecklenburg County's agreement became the model for coordination between DHS and these local offices. Now, these local offices that I'm talking about, they're almost entirely county sheriff's offices. There's a few state highway patrols, Rhode Island, Missouri, and a few others in the early part of the 2000s that entered into these agreements, but they really had they didn't have any, they didn't actually detain anybody. So the vast majority of these are counties, or sometimes they're local jurisdictions. Since 2006, there's been 80 agencies that have signed these agreements. The program has largely been phased out, but between 2006 and about 2010 or so, 2010, 11, 12, there's about 80 agencies that signed on to these 287G programs. And what 287G does is that it trains local police officers as immigration agents. And they have the power, those local police officers that have ICE training, right, that is, a few days worth of training with ICE, gives them the power to interrogate, arrest, and detain anybody that they suspect is in violation of immigration law. Okay, this can happen during a routine traffic stop. This can happen in the case, it widely happened in Maricopa County and Phoenix, just via racial profiling. And so the impact of this program was very substantial in the surge in deportations. So over 80 agencies and 1,600 police officers were deputized as a result of this program. Okay. So what I'm going to argue here is that these two things are actually closely linked, that deporting a lot of people resulted in people losing incomes or families losing incomes within their home. That resulted in people not being able to make their mortgage payments, which resulted in foreclosures. Okay, so let me just kind of walk through our conceptual diagram here. So it starts with deportations, right? We know that the interior enforcement, the changes in our priorities, resulted in a surge in deportations. We can see that in lots of different ways. It also led to out-migration, so people were responding to local enforcement by leaving areas, right, in order to prevent themselves from being deported in some cases. I'd say there's mixed evidence on this actually happening, but theoretically it's possible. There's also pretty well-known effects on the wages and employment status of unauthorized workers. So this research is actually still pretty premature. This body of work is still pretty premature, but the good kind of causal estimates that we have, or kind of plausibly causal estimates that we have, suggest that unauthorized workers, employment among unauthorized workers and the wages declined in these areas that had high enforcement, and that the wages of other workers increased because of the drop in the supply of unauthorized folks. So both of these things are happening, that interior enforcement, this 287G program, is leading to some people being deported and some people leaving. And then that results in income loss within Latino homes. Now you might think, well, unauthorized persons can't buy a home. And they don't buy homes, but they often live in homes that are owned by somebody else. And by our estimate, about a third of the 7.7 million undocumented Latinos actually do in fact live in owner-occupied housing. So that they're living in homes that may have been purchased by somebody else, but that they are part of that, but that is where they live. The majority of these, like I already mentioned, are households that have mixed status adults, that is at least one unauthorized person and one authorized person. And those kinds of households outnumber kind of sole undocumented status homes. There hasn't been a huge amount of quantitative work on this, but there's been some fantastic qualitative work by the Migration Policy Institute, by the Urban Institute, by Tanya Golash-Boza, and others that have shown that these mixed status households and the undocumented persons do in fact live in own homes, and that they contribute to the mortgage payments. That undocumented folks, that those mortgage payments are conditional on the income being contributed by undocumented persons. And that those forces all combine to reduce incomes in the Latino homes. That is, when people are deported or they leave throughout migration, that is, the undocumented members of the households leave throughout migration. That results in declines in incomes. And we don't have good quantitative estimates of this, but there's, looking at the qualitative work or kind of the case study work, we see pretty strong evidence of this. So there was a great report by the Migration Policy Institute that followed a series of families after worksite raids. They found that those families had income losses that ranged from about half of their income to total losses, to 100% losses. There's been other recent work that has shown that families struggle to make rent or to make mortgage payments. And we can also see the same process. We can see this process kind of quantitatively by tracking remittance payments, using the Mexican Migration Project, actually, to look at changes in remittance behaviors among people who were living in these counties that had these local enforcement regimes. And these, of course, are compounded by the new legal costs that these families are accruing, right? These can be very, very substantial. The estimates that I've seen from this report in a PI were that it can cost about $20,000 in order to support somebody who's being detained, right? In order to hire a lawyer, to fight, to try to persuade the system to let their family member free. Not very successful in doing so, but that both the incomes are declining and their household expenses are growing. And so that, of course, means that it's going to be increasingly difficult to make payments on mortgages, on rents, and so that income loss results in housing instability. It sometimes manifests through additional household crowding, right? Your cousin, your friend, your brother comes into your household. That has all sorts of interesting or important dynamics or implications for family well-being, for family relationships, for living arrangements more broadly. But it also means, from the qualitative work, that there's pretty clear signs that families are struggling in order to make their payments. And that, again, the report from Migration Policy Institute that followed these families post a series of worksite raids found that about half the families that they followed lost their homes within 1 year of the raid. And then, of course, I should have backed up. This is just, so I'm making the link to foreclosures. And so here we're going to try to show that there's a plausibly causal relationship between deportations or between enforcement and foreclosures, and that this might help us explain these really high levels of cumulative foreclosure among the Latino population. It's also possible that there's broader spillover effects on communities and on other groups. This might mean that there's the spillover effects of deportations on the local housing market might have impacts on black and white homeowners and on housing prices within those areas. We know that there's economic impacts of deportation and foreclosure on local economies. There's evidence that this is particularly sharp in Latino areas. And that, thinking long term, these are likely to have pretty strong implications for wealth accumulation of native-born families, and ultimately for the well-being of Latino households and families for generations to come. So Jody Vallejo has, in her book From Barrios to Burbs, talks extensively about how Mexican families have loyalty to their Mexican middle-class families have loyalty to their less fortunate family members, and that that found evidence that they were asked to help make mortgage payments to stall foreclosures for relatives. Okay, so the impacts of these deportations are affecting other families in important ways. So what we're going to try to do here, as is hopefully clear by now, is to connect enforcement with foreclosures, and let me show you how we're going to do that. So we're going to leverage variation in the 287G program, and I'll talk a little bit about our analytic approach, our identification strategy in a second, but let me talk about the data we're going to use. We have kind of three important pieces of information. So the first is that we have to have good data on foreclosures. Unfortunately, the federal government doesn't collect information on foreclosures. Those records are all kept at the local level, and so in order for you to gain access to foreclosure documents, you have to work with some of these commercial enterprises that actually go out to local counties, and pull the raw data from local offices and digitize it. And so that's what we did. We worked with RealityTrack in order to get their entire database. We got everything that they had. It's over 30 million foreclosure documents. These aren't actually, they didn't go through the process of identifying foreclosures, they just give you documents. And if you're familiar with the foreclosure process, you know that there are lots of stages in that process before you get to foreclosure. So it's a process that took us several years in order to to generate the data that we're going to use here. But basically what we do is we develop an algorithm to identify the same borrower and housing unit within this database. Okay, so we have addresses and we have names, but the forms might be a little different, so we have to match on a variety of characteristics. So we were able to do that, and we limit our analysis to what we call first visible foreclosures. Those include actual foreclosed homes, bank repossessions, but they also include homes that were lost to auction. Okay, so it's just one home, one observation per borrower/unit. We estimate from this procedure that there were close to 10 million foreclosures between 2005 and 2012. Unfortunately, these data don't include any information on race. So we impute race of the householder of the foreclosure based on census block data. So we take we geocode every single foreclosure, we overlay census block data, and then we assign probabilities to those foreclosures that are equal to the racial composition of the census block. I can talk more later on about alternative approaches for dealing with this. We've tried a number of different ways, but this is kind of the simplest way of representing these data. These come from decennial census records. And then we use these to calculate race-specific foreclosure rates, and you can see what the average county rate is for Latinos here. So this is the percent of homes that were foreclosed on in the average county. This is actually the average county in our analytic sample, which is about 430 counties, and I'll talk about why that is in a minute. But you can see that it went from a very low base to about 1.5% of homes being foreclosed on in a year in the average county. There's massive heterogeneity in these rates. The data that we're going to use on immigration enforcement comes from the program that I talked about, the 287G program. And so we have participation in 287G that was obtained by FOIA to the Department of Homeland Security. And these data, actually, their current agreements are on their webpage. You can go to their webpage right now and you can see which counties participate in 287G. We have the full set of all counties and the year of implementation. We actually have the agreements themselves and the type of arrangement they have. We also have, although I'm not going to show it here, we also have the number of detentions, so the number of deportations that each jurisdiction in every year was credited. What's important for our strategy is that we not only have the counties, the green counties, that were successful in negotiating a 287G program, we also were able to obtain the counties that submitted an application for 287G, but that were denied. Okay, and so these are all the red counties. And so there's 42 counties in our sample. It's a little bit larger than that actually in total. But because of restrictions on our census estimates, we have to eliminate some of the very small counties. 42 counties that ever approved 287G and 62 that were denied. So I can talk more about why, the reasons for why they were denied. It mostly had to do with the resources, that DHS was not convinced that the police agencies either had the know-how or the resources in order to successfully implement the program. A number of places tried multiple times, so they were denied and then applied again and were accepted. We don't have the sample. Our sample isn't large enough for us to do like a difference on those counties alone. But we're going to leverage variation in the timing of both of these things, and the geographic, the spatial variation, in order to generate some plausibly causal estimates of the impact on foreclosures. So I mentioned the Secure Communities program. We're not using Secure Communities here. Secure Communities was a program, a more recent program that was in some ways similar to 287G, but different in a number of key ways. One is that it was mostly administered at the federal level, so that the local officials they still had a lot of control, but considerably less control in determining detentions. It's mostly focused on criminals, okay? And this is a kind of a reprioritization of our immigration system in the last few years that has tried to make we're still deporting a lot of people, but change the relative share of criminals to non-criminals. And then kind of most importantly for our purposes, that it happened much later in the process. So it kind of happened after the wave of foreclosures. And so it's not as useful for us to model in this process. It also was strongly non-randomly rolled out in relation to the border. You can see that there in the maps. Okay. And then we also have to get data on that unauthorized population. This ends up not being kind of a very important measure for this stage of the analysis, but we do have some measures that rely on this. So we have fairly good estimates at the national level and the state level on unauthorized or undocumented populations. The way that we generate these county level estimates is using this approach that does a data fusion between the survey of income and program participation that has information on immigration status. We can establish the correlations in SIP. We can build a multiple imputation model in census data in order to predict the number of undocumented persons with specific characteristics in each county. Okay, so Jenny Van Hook and Randy Capps and Jim Bachmeyer developed this approach. Some of the work that I've done with Emily Greenman helped to establish the baseline estimates in SIP. And so we use that. We use the 2001 SIP, the Census 2000, in order to generate these estimates. And what's nice about that is that we're not only able to estimate the size of the undocumented population, but we can estimate characteristics of the undocumented population at the local level. So we have information not only on like the percent of Hispanic immigrants who are unauthorized, but the proportion of the unauthorized population that is living in owned homes. So, like I mentioned, we're leveraging this spatial and temporal variation in 287G applications as kind of the main part of our analysis. We set this up as a difference in difference that you can see in the second part here, that's set up in event time, where we're going to look at the impact kind of pre and post the implementation of this policy. We also match our counties based on the probability of participation in the program. Using propensity scores, or we actually implement these not as matching but as the inverse probability of treatment weights, and you can see the kind of the set of matching characteristics or covariates that are included in that model. I'm going to show you results for two samples. Our full county sample of 433 places, and then our what I call the quasi-experimental set of places that is just the 287G applicants. Now, I didn't mention why we have to, there's about 3,000 counties, there's a little more than that, 3,100 counties in the U.S. Why we have to drop down to 433? That's largely because of this, that because the census data, the lowest level of geography is what's called the PUMA. The PUMAs they're typically bigger than counties. We have to, we eliminate counties where the PUMA boundaries don't match up with county boundaries very well. It's also true that here, with our foreclosure data, we have great data for metropolitan areas and for larger counties, the data is either incomplete or non-existent for really small areas. So fortunately, we don't lose a large number of counties, but there are a few. Okay. Okay, so here's just, these are the results from the matching model. We're predicting 287G participation. These are, this is the probit, these are the average marginal effects. And what you can see here is that the only thing that really matters, other than population size, is the share of the unauthorized share. So in counties that had large undocumented populations, they were much more likely to implement a 287G program, which shouldn't be too big of a surprise, but is interesting nonetheless. And that's true in both our full set of counties and our applicant counties. Now, when we use our inverse probability treatment weights in order to balance these characteristics, you can see that we do a pretty good job of that, but we do a much better job in our quasi-experimental sample, in our set of 287G applicants, which is what you'd expect, right? Those counties tend to be much more similar, and so that there we are able to match fairly well on the key variable, the unauthorized population, but not so well in our full set of the 433 counties. All right, so here's the first set of results. This is for all counties. These are the estimates, again, of the 287G program on foreclosures. The diff and diffs here are set up in event time so that you're getting the estimates before implementation, the implementation year, and then in 2-year bins after implementation. Okay, so it's, the pre-287G is exactly what you want to see, but there's no significant differences in foreclosure rates between counties that implemented 287G and those that did not. Either for overall foreclosures or for Latino foreclosures. In the year of implementation, there's no significant difference either. This really isn't big of a surprise because the foreclosure process actually takes a while. So you would anticipate that it's going to take a year or 2 or 3 in order to actually see any results. And then in the post period, we see pretty substantial estimates, right? So these are, this is an OLS. So these are 0.63 percentage points of an increase in foreclosure rates off a base, if you remember, of about 1.5. So that's like a 40% effect. It's huge. And it's also about a fourth of the standard deviation. And you can see that it wanes a little bit over time, but not really. It's kind of consistent. It's also, as you would expect, much larger for the Hispanic foreclosures than it is for overall foreclosures. I'll show you other groups here in a minute. So here is the analysis that is based on those 144 counties that applied for 287G, the accepted and the rejected counties. Here we see really only effects for Latinos. They're marginally significant, but you have to remember that our sample here is not huge, 104, because it's longitudinally set up, and we have all these fixed effects. So, we're being kind of fairly loose with our significance levels at the 10% level, but we again we see consistently positive results and no associations in the pre-period. Here are the results for blacks and whites. So this has had us perplexed for a while. We don't observe any. This is in our the 144 applicant counties. We don't observe any associations with black foreclosure, at least any significant ones or any large ones. We have some marginally significant associations for white foreclosures. Now, I didn't include the slide here, but one thing that we've done is that we've looked at white foreclosures in a few different ways. And what we found is that this effect is driven by foreclosures in neighborhoods where whites and Hispanics are sharing neighborhoods, right? So it's either two processes are at play, that there's some spillover of Latino foreclosures on white homes in the neighborhood, or more likely that our way of imputing race in neighborhoods is not actually corresponding, is not actually generating the correct foreclosure rates for Hispanics, because it's assuming kind of an equal probability of foreclosure across all these different racial contexts. We've also looked at whether this is moderated by white Latino segregation, and it very strongly is. So in counties where segregation is high, there's no effect on white foreclosures. Where segregation is low, where there's more integration between whites and Hispanics, we observe effects. Okay, so it's not maybe the most compelling evidence for explaining this, but it's kind of the best we've been able to do so far. The other thing we can do is that, we're not able to, I showed you the conceptual model where we link deportations with foreclosures and all the interesting components, the mechanisms about why that process happens. Our model here isn't able, we're not able to actually test those mechanisms or to generate kind of plausibly causal estimates of those, but we can do a few things. So one is that we can try to see whether areas that deported or detained a lot of people actually, whether we observed larger foreclosure effects there, and that's exactly what we see. So in the counties where we see that a large portion of the unauthorized population was detained, right, 5% or more, we observe these big effects on foreclosures. And in areas where it was more weakly enforced, we observe much smaller effects that are statistically indistinguishable from zero, although they're still kind of moderately large. And then the other thing that we do is we look at counties where Latinos are most likely to live in owner-occupied housing, right? So you would anticipate that in the counties where Latinos are actually living in owned homes, those are the areas where you would see the largest effects on foreclosures. Whereas where they're renting, you wouldn't anticipate there to be large foreclosure effects. And again, that's exactly what we see. We do see, positive associations in areas that have lower ownership rates than undocumented folks. But the estimates in counties that have higher shares of undocumented folks in owner-occupied homes are much larger. So we think this helps us kind of build out that conceptual model to try to understand what the linkages are, and it all provides what we think as conceptually relevant arguments for how this process actually laid out. So, to summarize here, we found that interior immigration enforcement accelerated the housing process for Latino households, that the 287G program in particular resulted in higher foreclosure rates for Latinos than for Latinos living in other counties. We find this association in both out of our full set of counties and in our kind of quasi-experimental set using just the application data, and that we find results that are consistent with the mechanisms that we hypothesized, in that the effects were larger in counties where Latinos were more likely to be detained and in counties where Latinos were particularly likely to live in owner-occupied housing. So the implication is just that our immigration enforcement policies help to fuel the housing crisis, right? And that helps to explain some of the this unobserved gap between Latino foreclosure rates and other groups. That part of the missing piece in the story about why Latinos were hard hit was because they were being deported in record numbers, and it was affecting families. It was affecting their families in big ways. And then the big implications are what this tells us about incorporation, and that all depends on what kind of the lasting effects of deportation and foreclosure and economic hardship are on the pace of incorporation, and ultimately how the second generation is going to fare when they've experienced these two powerful forces that disrupted their homes in big ways. So I'm going to stop here and give you an opportunity to ask questions, and so I'm happy to talk about any of this or kind of where we're headed in the future. So thank you very much.